Welcome back to Speed Bumps with Charlie Kimball. I'll be your host, Charlie Kimball, and today's guest is a close personal friend of mine and a connection through my wife. In fact, my wife likes to call him her best friend from college. He is a New York Times best-selling author. Today's guest, Morgan Housel, he's that rare breed of author who can make the dismal science of economics feel like a page-turning thriller, except with fewer car chases, unfortunately, and more charts. The man does love a chart. An award-winning author and partner at the Collaborative Fund, Morgan spent years turning financial concepts into simple, relatable stories that even your grandmother could understand and would probably give you investment advice about afterwards. But before he was diving into the intricacies of human behavior and finance, Morgan was literally diving down mountains as a member of the U.S. ski team. Well, most people might think hurtling down an icy slope at breakneck speeds is terrifying. Morgan decided it was the perfect training for navigating the wild world of investing. After all, both require quick thinking, steady nerves, and a healthy appreciation for risk management. His book, The Psychology of Money, which has sold over 6 million copies worldwide. It's basically the Netflix of personal finance. Binge-worthy, full of twists, and leaving you with a lot to think about once it's over. Morgan's writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Motley Fool, and a bunch of other places where people pretend to read the articles, but really just scroll for the really interesting graph. Like I said, the man loves a graph. When he's not untangling the mysteries of human behavior and money, he's probably trying to explain to his kids why compound interest is way cooler than superheroes. Spoiler, they're not yet convinced. He lives somewhere between a spreadsheet and a good book, armed with a keyboard, an endless supply of analogies, perfect ones at that, and maybe a pair of ski goggles just in case. And whether you're a seasoned investor or someone who thinks diversification is just a fancy word for picking a variety of snacks, Morgan House's insights will make you rethink your relationship with money and maybe even laugh a little along the way. Morgan, thanks for joining us here on Speed Bumps.
So good to see you, Charlie. That was a wonderful intro. I appreciate it.
It's amazing what AI can help you with these days. I tell you, if between his input and my understanding of you and the fact that I've read your books and listened to your podcast, it's a little intimidating actually because I don't write, at least not well, and my podcast is I would say in the juvenile stage compared to yours. But the best advice I've ever heard with a podcast was just hit record and see where it goes.
Well, here's the thing, Charlie. As you mentioned, you and I have a long history going back well more than a decade. And the first time I met you, I drove a Toyota Corolla and you were an IndyCar driver. So there's been a little bit of intimidation maybe on both ends of this, let's say.
A little bit of back and forth for sure. So my wife claims that she is the root of all happiness and joy in your life because she set you up on a blind date with your now wife. How'd that first date go?
Oh, so that is not an exaggeration. That your wife was your wife planted the seed of what is my entire life now, and it starts back in college. And I'll tell you the early story of this, and I'll get to the terrible first date just in a second. But my first day of college at the University of Southern California, brand new student, I didn't know anybody, and on the first day of orientation, I wanted to be a business student. And we got to orientation. I was a little bit late. And when you got into this giant room, they had all of the majors set out by section of the room. Biology students over here, English students over here, business students over there. I go over to the business table and there were no seats left because I was a little bit late. But right next to the business table was the economics table. And this sounds ridiculous, but literally at the time I was like, I guess I'm an economics major. There's no seats at the business table. And so I sat at the economics table next to a girl named Kathleen. And Kathleen became my inseparable best friend. She and I just clicked instantly. And all throughout college, we never left each other's side. It was wonderful. We have the same sense of humor. It was phenomenal. Kathleen got tired of me complaining that I was single. So she said, hey, I have a friend that I work with named Gretchen. She's single too. I'm going to set you guys up on a blind date. That was our first date. Gretchen became my wife. Kathleen became your wife. But now we'll get to the terrible first date that Kathleen set us up on.
Yeah, well, but before you get there, hold on, Morgan. But you and Kathleen like bonded over Bastangos. I've heard Bastangos spoken in mythical terms, and like it when it comes out of Kathleen's mouth, Bastangos has this air of a Michelin starred restaurant for college students. What was it? What is it? Like, what were you guys? How did that bonding over food happen?
Not a bad description. And you have to keep in mind, we were, I don't know, 19 or 20 years old at the time. There was a cheap Italian restaurant right off campus at USC called Bastangos. And it, for me, I was, 20 years old. I was always starving. I weighed about 110 pounds. I could not get enough food. I was not eating enough. And so once in a while, Kathleen and I would go to Bastango. We can get a bowl of fettuccine Alfredo and breadsticks for $7 or something. And without Bastango, I think half of USC would be famished. I think they fed the campus. It was always a line out the door. It was cheap. It was fast. It kept everyone going. So Kathleen and I went to Bastango, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a week. It really kept us going for a while. And that was also, and Kathleen was not in a sorority. I was not in a fraternity. We really kind of both of us had a very small group of friends. I would say both of us, Kathleen and I, our social group was hers larger than mine, but mine was maybe like 5 people, which was fine. That's what I've been my entire life. I've always just had a few close friends and that's it. And so, but because we didn't have a massive social group, we really just had each other and a couple of other people to go to cheap Italian restaurants a couple of days a week.
So when it comes to your first date with Gretchen, you don't go the reliable Bastangos route, correct? Okay. So now I want to hear the story about how it all went tragically wrong that first date.
So the other part of this is that before the first date, before Gretchen and I had even met each other yet, Kathleen told me, and I think she may have told Gretchen too. She said, "Morgan, you are going to marry this girl. I just know it. I can just feel it. This is your future wife that you're about to meet tonight." And I was so nervous because of that, because I think I took her seriously. And it was like, don't screw this up. So in my 21-year-old mind, don't screw this up meant take her to the most expensive, extravagant restaurant in Beverly Hills, which is called Spago. The chef was Wolfgang Puck, who was there that night. He literally came to our table that night to ask us how the food was. And keep in mind, we're 20 years old at this time. And so we went there, and the stakes were so high. It was not like a casual, get to know you. In my mind, and I think Gretchen's mind, it was like, you're meeting your future spouse tonight. Good luck, kind of thing. So anyways, the first day was terrible. I didn't enjoy it. She didn't enjoy it. Now, to put on a good face, the next day after that first date, I texted Gretchen and I said, hey, I had a blast last night. Can't wait to do it again. She wrote back and she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't." Send text. and so I was like, "Oh, okay, at least she's very direct. I don't know, at least she's able to figure out." And then so that set off a month of us just kind of clearly not dating, going anywhere. But then after that, it kind of clicked after that, and we've been together ever since. And that was, I guess, 18 years ago now. So it started off terribly, but thankfully it all came around.
Well, so I can credit Kathleen for multiple people's endless happiness. Myself, yours through Gretchen. But what a great story. And she'd always said, "Oh yeah, the first date was terrible. But I'm glad they got over that, right? It's like hit that speed bump first and move on from there."
And it was really like once the pressure of the first date was off, once we got over the like, "Hey, you're meeting your future spouse," which was terrifying. Once we were just like, "Hey, let's just hang out as friends for a little bit," then it was like, boom, it clicked from there, and it was no problem.
Well, I think there's probably a lesson in there that you can maybe just learn and get to know each other first, instead of being like, "All right, let's just," like that whole Love Is Blind thing where you like first time you see your person you're engaged to, that I don't know. I don't get it. It's not my thing. But anyways, before USC though, what, like the intro, you were on the US ski team. Where did you first fall in love with the mountain and with skiing, and what did that look like for you growing up?
Yeah. Well, first I was on a ski division called Far West, which would be like, let's call it 1 or 2 notches down from the official US ski team. But I grew up ski racing in Lake Tahoe. And one of the quirks about it is that unlike most other sports, ski racing views school as getting in the way, views high school as getting in the way. And so I did, and all of my peers did, basically bypassed high school. We did an independent kind of homeschooled program that was a joke. There was nothing involved. It was basically when I was 16, they were like, hey, prove that you can write your name and tie your shoes and add single digit numbers. And good for you. Here's a diploma. Get out of here. So I more or less bypassed high school, as did all of my ski racing peers. And we skied 6 days a week, 10 months a year. We'd go to New Zealand in the winter, or their winter, our summer,
Right.
to ski. So we were skiing 10 months a year, and it was awesome. I loved it. I loved it because it fit my personality perfectly because it's such an independent sport. You are on a ski team, but very similar to what you did, Charlie. At the end of the day, it's just
Right.
you. It's just you, even if you're on a quote unquote
Right.
team. And so I think it taught us to grow up very quickly because we were skiing all over the world when we were, 15, 16 years old. The coaches are usually off drunk at a bar somewhere. So we grew up very quickly, for better or worse. And I look back, I don't think we knew that at the time, but I think when you don't go to high school, so there's no real regimen in your life, there's no real schedule, and
Right.
you're kind of on your own to make your own mistakes and learn from your own mistakes very young. Looking back, I think it was a very good experience to learn how to be an adult
Right.
at an age when you would have otherwise been a child.
And I think that happens a lot in competitive sports, in racing as well. Okay, my parents had a very different perspective. They said, look, bees don't race. They said, you have to go to school and get good grades. But I missed, I think my second semester of senior year, I missed 27 days of school out of like 90 because I was at a racetrack and I was testing. The racetracks were always booked on weekends for races. So we'd go and do practice days during the week. And that meant I'd miss school. And like for me, my parents were always like, okay, go get your homework before you'd go miss 2 days of school and do it in the hotel. But it still taught me a lot of, hey, I have to go up to this adult who's in a position of power and say, I'm going to be gone the next couple days. Can you give me the homework so that I can keep up with class? And I think you see it. The Olympics just finished this summer, right? You see it in summer and winter Olympics. These athletes, especially some of the ones that are so age dependent, you have to bypass high school, do independent study. You have to grow up and be a professional that's on live primetime network TV. You compete, your adrenaline's up, you come off that floor, off that mountain, off that sled, off that racetrack, and someone sticks a microphone in your face and you've got to sound intelligent and report what happened and give some insights. It really forces a maturity earlier than it might in normal high school.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
still think I haven't matured past that.
I was gonna say, there's many sides of me that is still a 15-year-old at heart. But I saw the study this morning actually that I'm paraphrasing all this. I don't have the study in front of me, but it was like one of the biggest indicators for how well your child's going to do in life is how independent they got to be when they were children and teens. And there's a thing right now that I love, and I'm speaking so far outside my domain. I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, called independence therapy for kids, where it's like particularly for some subgroup of children who have a hard time kind of integrating into society, doing an independence therapy. So one that we've offered my son, he has yet to take us up on this, is we told him, he's 8, and we said, I will give you $100 and drop you off at Target, and you can go in and get anything you want, but you have to do it yourself. You have to check out yourself. You have to talk to the cash register. You have to hand her the money and figure out when you're going through the store. You have to keep track of what you've purchased to make sure it's less than $100, including tax. And if you do that, I'll give you $100 bill. You can get anything you want. He has not taken us up on it yet. But that kind of thing, I think, is very good
Right.
for kids at that age to show like, you don't need me. You can do this yourself. You are completely and utterly capable of doing this on your own. And I think the more you put that onto your children, the evidence is the better they're going to do as adults. It's so good for their self-esteem. It's so good that once you, and I think the thing about independence therapy, the Target thing seems small and
Right.
trivial. But in the child's mind, when they think, wow, I did that by myself, it opens up a million other things that they know that they can do by themselves now in a way that just compounds on itself.
And I look at my experience, right? Your experience traveling to New Zealand and skiing in the summer here, their winter, as a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid, you learned how to travel. And okay, they speak the same language, fortunately, well, mostly down there. So you got to learn how to travel and different foods and lingo and dialect. And for me, after high school, I moved on my own to go race cars in Europe, and I was figuring out how to buy a car and get a driver's license and figure out visas. And yes, I had oversight from my parents and my race teams and things like that. And I was sharing a house with my older sister at the time. But at the same time, it's like you figure all that stuff out. And now it's like, yeah, I could go anywhere in the world and figure out how to get from A to B. Like when we, as an
Yeah.
IndyCar series, went to race in Japan, my we got an extra night in Tokyo before flying out. My dad was there with me, and I go, "Hey, Dad, I found this like kind of looks like a locals restaurant, and it's in this neighborhood, and I think I can't read any of the language, but I can figure it out." And so we went, we walked around, we walked in, and like no joke, we were the only non-Japanese person in that restaurant, and it was one of the best meals I've ever had, and probably the cheapest. And we like they handed us a menu and we were like, I don't know, kind of hungry. And they just kept bringing us food and they were like, more. And we're like, no, 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 we're good. And then handed us a bill. And it was amazing. And that confidence came from learning as a kid to be independent, be like, well, we'll figure it out. And
Yeah.
like, worst case, we get in a cab and we give them the hotel name. We come back here and we order at the restaurant here. Like, we're not going to starve, but knowing that you can do that. And if it goes wrong, you can, figure your way out. A lot of that experience, like you had on the ski team, really builds that long-term confidence. Is the goal at that
Yeah.
point to be an Olympian? What's in your mind at 15, 16 on the ski team?
I think early on, when you're maybe 11, 12, of course, that's everyone's goal. It was actually pretty clear, though, by the time you even got to 14, 15, who was going to be a superstar and who wasn't. The four people who I grew up with skiing who became world-class Olympians, Julia Mancuso, Ted Ligety, Lindsey Vonn, who was named Lindsey Kildow back then, and Marco Sullivan. It was obvious, with the exception of Ted Ligety.
Small names.
It was
names.
It was obvious from the time
names.
when Julia Mancuso was 5, you knew she was going to be an Olympian. They were so far in their own universe that it was a joke. It was equivalent of like when you watch LeBron James high school games and you're like, it's just a joke. He's just literally 100 times better than everybody. The people who became Olympians, the skiers who became Olympians, were like that from the time they were children. And so even by the time that we were 14, 15, it was very clear who was separating from the rest of the pack. And certainly by the time we were 17, it was very clear. One of my coaches told me, I was probably about 16 at this time, they said, a really good goal for all you guys is to make a good college team. And because it's really clear, who was going to be Olympian and who wasn't. And so, hey, if you're not, like, no problem, but like, try to get on a good college team. The one exception to this rule that I mentioned earlier was Ted Ligety. Now, if you're not a ski racing, maybe you've never heard of that name, but Ted Ligety is a guy from Utah who is the greatest male giant slalom skier probably of all time. If some people might quibble with that, but I think that's directionally right. He's one of the greatest American skiers ever.
Right.
When Ted Ligety was 17, he was very good, not great. So he was an exception to this rule. I think when he was 12, he was good, not great. And then he won the Olympics. He won the Olympic gold in 2006. So I think he would have been like 21 or 22. So he just had this utter explosion out of the middle of nowhere where he went from like a decent regional skier to Olympic gold medalist in 3 or 4 years. That is so unheard of to have that kind of progression. I think I'm sure that's true in gymnastics, basketball, whatever it might be, that usually the superstars were superstars as kids. You've seen the videos of Tiger Woods golfing when he was 4. He's amazing. He hits the ball straighter and farther than any adult, And so that was the one exception to that. But, and you said to get back to your question, no, I did not see myself as becoming an Olympian. It was clear from the time I was 13 or 14 that I was not. Now, this is an interesting point too, because some of the coaches did not want to accept that for any of their athletes, and they wanted to push us as hard as they can. And my mom, to her credit, this was so smart of her, would always say, like, would you stop pushing him? He's just having fun. Just leave him alone. I know he's not going to be an Olympian. He's just having fun skiing. Like, leave him alone. He's just having a good time. That was the right mentality, because I knew in my head I was not going to make it to the top, but I was having fun with my friends. It was a really good time. And so I think more, and this was 20 years ago. Sports are so much more competitive now. And I think that mentality that my mom had,
Yeah.
you could apply to any other sport, baseball, basketball, soccer. Look, you're probably not going to be on the US team, and that's okay. You're still learning a tremendous amount about life and about independence and about teamwork. And those are valuable life skills that will stick with you forever. So enjoy it while you're there, because the problem are the kids who do push themselves too hard, burn out.
Right.
And then you're going to lose all those skills. You might as well just have fun doing it and make it sustainable.
And it also teaches you that you may not succeed at everything you do, and it doesn't mean it's not going to be a good experience along the way.
Right. And so when I look back at this career of, not making it to the tippy top, not a single second of it seems wasted. It's some of the most valuable experiences and memories that I have in
So
my life.
as you go, what would you say the biggest speed bump, name of the podcast, got to get to them. What would you say the biggest speed bump in your ski racing development, that time period was that you had to face and really made it real?
Well, for me, it's very clear what happened. And I've told the story before, but it was not only the biggest event of my ski racing career, but probably the biggest event of my life, frankly. And it was in 2001. So I and my friends were about 16, 17 years old at the time. And two of my inseparable best friends who I'd known for years, Brendan Allen and Brian Richmond, we were skiing one day in February of 2001 at Squaw Valley, which was our home mountain. And Squaw had just been blasted by two storms in the previous month. One was a very cold storm, and cold storms drop very light, fluffy snow. A week after that, it was a very warm storm. So it dropped several feet of like wet, heavy cement snow. And that's very important because when you have a layer of fluffy snow and then a layer of heavy snow on top of it, that layering of heavy snow on top of light snow makes the mountain very prone to avalanches. It's textbook avalanche conditions. Now, we would because we were 17 and we were very good skiers and we were rebels and dumb at the time, we would very often ski out of bounds, where you duck under the ropes that say do not cross and you get the good skiing. Now, when you do that, when you ski out of bounds, there's usually no chairlift at the bottom because you're out of bounds. So what we would do is we would ski off the backside of Squaw out of bounds, and it would spit us out on like a backcountry road, and we would hitchhike back to the mountain. And we had done this many times. It was a pain in the ass because we had to hitchhike back, but it felt cool because it was a rebel kind of thing. So anyways, the three of us do this run in February 2001. And when we were skiing down, we triggered a very small avalanche. And it was kind of, I think it was the first time when I was skiing that I felt what an avalanche felt like. It was a very small avalanche. It kind of came up to our knees, but you instantly realize how powerful it is, because instantly when you get caught in an avalanche, you have no control whatsoever anymore. The mountain's pushing you. It's going to take you wherever it wants to go. But that avalanche ended very quickly, and we skied down and hitchhiked back. And then when we hitchhiked back to the mountain, Brendan and Brian said, "Hey, that was awesome. Let's go do it again. Let's go do that run again." And I didn't want to. And I don't know exactly why I didn't want to, but I said, "Hey, rather than hitchhiking back, you guys go do that run, and I will drive my truck around and pick you up so you don't have to hitchhike." We said, "Great, awesome, good plan. Let's go do it." Brendan and Brian went off to do another run. I went to go get my truck to pick them up. I went to like the pickup spot 20 minutes later to pick them up, and they weren't there. And I didn't really think anything of it. I thought maybe this is before we had cell phones. We were always out of touch with each other. I thought maybe they already hitchhiked back. I think I was a couple minutes late. All right. I go back to the locker room where I expect to see them, and they weren't there either. And nobody else would see them. And then a couple hours goes on where no one's really seen them yet. And I'm not panicked at this point, but later that day, Brian's mom called me at home and said, "Hey, Brian didn't show up for work today. And I just heard that Brendan missed a dentist appointment today. Do you know where they are?" And I said, "Yes, no, I didn't know where they were, but I said, well, we skied the backside of Squaw this morning. I was going to pick them up, but they never showed up and I haven't seen them since." And Brian's mom, who was an expert skier herself, said, "Oh my God," click, hung up the phone. Hours went by. We eventually got search and rescue involved, called the police, got search and rescue involved. And to speed the story up, the punchline is, the next morning, about 12 hours later, the search and rescue team with a team of search dogs and these giant probe poles found Brendan and Brian buried under 6 feet of snow. They were caught in a massive avalanche and killed. And what's interesting about this story too is I have now known, not best friends like they were, but I think I've at least been acquaintances or known, I think 8 skiers who've died in avalanches. It's a big problem if you're
Wow.
skiing out of bounds, which nobody should do unless they truly know what they're doing. And so I was 17 at the time. And I always say when I tell this story, everybody, including you, has lost a friend that was dear to them. I know I'm not unique in that sense, but this was my first moment of risk, because up until that point, I had a very good childhood. Nothing bad had ever happened to me. I had a perfect childhood. And so it was my first taste of like, hey, the world can actually be very fragile in a massive, massive way. One of the things that I always say taught me about risk from the story is that Brendan, Brian, and I knew that what we did was risky. We knew that it was wrong. We knew that it was dangerous, but we thought the consequences of that risk meant that we would, like, our coaches would yell at us, or maybe we would get our season
Right.
passes revoked when we got caught skiing out of bounds. Never in a million years do we think the consequences of the risks that we took meant that we'd die. Like, what? No, no,
Right.
never. And so
Yeah.
one of the things that, not at the time, but as I became an adult looking back on this, it was like, the average consequences of a risk don't matter. All that matters are the extreme tail end consequences of any risk that you're taking. And I think once you view risk through that light, like you all, like the worst case scenario is all that matters in life. The average consequences of the risk in your day never matter. They're just petty
Right.
annoyances. And once you think about risk through that lens, I think a lot of other things in your life become clear.
And okay, fast forwarding a little bit, when you look at risk through the lens of the extremes matter, when you apply it to what you've written about in a couple of books in financial perspectives and psychology, it becomes very real, right? You're not worried about the average gains or losses. You're worried about the tail end. You lose everything and have nothing to retire with, right? That's really what you're
You're a
talking about.
thousand percent right.
Yeah. And
Yeah, and in particularly in money, when if you were to watch CNBC or like read financial news, they frame risk as, oh, the Dow fell half a percentage point today, and like you're like, no, that's an average risk.
right,
What real risk is COVID, and the economy shuts down for 2 years. And if you owned a laundromat or a restaurant during that period, that's risk. Like,
right.
that's your real risk. It's the Great Depression. It's 9/11. You know, if you're in the airline industry, or if you're Disneyland, the year after 9/11 was like complete and utter catastrophe. And in your own life, it's major job loss, it's cancer, it's divorce, it's losing your house. And that's what risk is. So once you view risk through that lens, I've often thought that most people don't have their asset allocation of how they invest their money is not conservative enough. They're taking too much risk, because most people systematically underestimate the odds of a big catastrophe in your life, because it's too painful to think about the odds of you losing your job, of you or your spouse getting cancer or something like that happens. It's too painful to even contemplate that. So most people don't prepare for those kinds of things. They prepare for average risks that don't actually pose them that much danger to begin
And
with.
so rather than the sentiment of hope for the best, plan for the worst, they're hoping for the best and planning for the average,
That's
because the
exactly
worst
right.
is very hard to consider because it is so scary and so, like, I don't know, it's a Debbie Downer to think about everything that can go wrong.
Right. And you see this, I mean, this is something like with health insurance. When most people think about their health insurance, they're like, oh, great, I can get my annual checkup for free. And you're like, or like for your dental insurance, great, I get my annual cleaning for free. No, like, those are not risks that you need to insure. That is just par for the course life. The risks that you need to insure of is like, what if I get in a terrible head-on car collision and I'm in the hospital for 6 months? That's what you need health
Right.
insurance for. Like, so that's just one way. Like, when people think about risk, they're thinking about things that actually don't pose them that much danger to begin with.
Okay, so that's like you're 17 at that point, and you get a very real, very raw exposure to risk and risk management. Do you keep skiing after that? Do you get back on the mountain? Do you duck a rope ever again in your life, or do you still have joy for the mountain, just in a different light?
Yeah, it was tough. That was February 2001, and in March or April 2001, I broke my back skiing.
Okay.
Sounds worse than it was. I didn't do any nerve damage, but I broke my back. So that was in a course of 8 weeks. My two best friends were killed, and then I broke my back. And that was a very clear, like, hey, I might be nearing the end of what I'm interested in doing here. So I was like, I might need to do something else with my life now. And I still skied. I still really enjoyed it. I like being out there with my friends. Skiing was always a social experience for me.
Mhm.
That's what I love the most, is just being out there with my friends. So I couldn't just abandon it because
Yeah.
this was my entire social life. But that was my progression towards, okay, I should probably maybe think about college and doing something more productive with my life, which took a couple years to get to. But now when I go out, no, just because I don't bounce like I used to. I'm not as flexible as I used to. I don't ski nearly as hard as I used to. But I took up skiing again with my son a couple years ago. He and I do a couple ski trips per year, including to Squaw,
Yeah.
where I grew up skiing. We went there last year, and it's awesome. I love it, and I feel like I can relive part of my childhood vicariously through him while doing it. It's awesome. But no, I do view it very differently. I think before Brendan and Brian died, I viewed it as a great fun sport, like you would view like a water balloon contest. It's a game. It's
Right.
fun. And after that, I viewed it as like, no, like this is like mountains can be weapons that you need to handle carefully. And if you don't, they will backfire on you very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I look and I think about like driving a road car. As a racing driver, we're prone to be comfortable going faster than is probably intelligent at times. And when you're that 16, 17, 18 years old, you think you're bulletproof, right? You think you're invincible. And the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a speeding ticket. Your coaches are going to yell at you. But then all of a sudden, like I look back and I had a great teammate. A couple of years after we were teammates, he was killed in a road car crash because he was going too fast. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's so now everyone's like, oh, do you drive really fast? And it's like, yeah, I maybe drive faster than I should, but also I don't push it like I used to, not like I did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And you had kids and you had a wife and you had, a mortgage and you had some of the other like realities of growing older. I won't say grow up because I'll never grow up, but growing older. And so you add those realities in, and all of a sudden it changes how you approach things.
One of the things I think about
Okay.
these
Well,
days, one little quick story here is,
yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
when we were growing up, the drugs that were in the world were both by and large alcohol and weed. And today,
Yeah.
what is in the world, and like though like were those dangers to us? Of course, particularly if you're 17 and you're drunk driving. Of course, that's a
Yeah.
danger. But today, what's out there in the world is fentanyl. And I would venture to say that
Yeah.
every single 18-year-old in America knows someone, at least first or second hand, who has died from fentanyl overdose. I know several,
Yeah.
and so now like the risk just grew 1,000-fold. When you and I were growing up, it was like if you're 16-year-old and you drink a couple beers, like by and large, like you're probably gonna be okay. Now it's you're at a party, someone hands you a pill, and you're dead an hour later.
Yeah.
Like the risk just exploded exponentially for being a teenager relative to what it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. And as a parent, that's terrifying. As a parent, it's like, okay, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a whole thing. Um, but you are a New York Times bestselling author. And I did hear a story once before a biology test that you were sleeping on the couch at Kathleen's place, and she said every 5 seconds, maybe every 5 or 10 minutes, you'd turn the light on because you couldn't sleep because you were worried you were going to forget something. You were so anxious about this biology test that you kept waking her up to review the material.
It's true.
Is that anxiety something true story, okay, good, I'm glad she wasn't lying to me. Um, is that anxiety something that you've had to overcome to, A, first write the book and be confident in writing articles for the Motley Fool, for the Wall Street Journal, like big boy newspapers, and then a book, and then publishing and promoting said book through speaking events and things like that? How'd you overcome that?
I think what was really true is that because I effectively didn't go to high school, particularly in those early 20 years when I finally made my way to college, I had such a tremendous chip on my shoulder that I felt like, And it was not a feeling. I think it was statistically true that I was dumber than everybody was there. And I needed to work so much harder. And a lot of the basic study skills and basic knowledge that other people got in high school, I didn't. And because of that, I always felt I was just terrified that I was going to fall behind. And I've really felt like I was given such an incredible gift by getting to go to USC that I felt like if I screwed it up and missed and dropped that opportunity because I failed a test or got kicked out of school for bad grades, I was it was so scary to me that I was going to lose this. So I think now look, every college student I think has test anxiety. I think mine was enhanced by this chip on my shoulder from given the academic background that I had or didn't have. And so, yeah, that was a lot of it. I do think when I look back, I think a lot of people would say something similar about their own life. When I look back at the last 20 years, if there was any advice I could give to myself 20 years ago, it would be like, hey, don't stress so much. Like things are going to be okay. Things aren't going to be perfect. They're not going to be easy, but things are going to be okay. It's all going to work out. It's going to be okay. But then I'm like, no, I think the reason things worked out is because I was worried. It was because I was always on red alert. What are the threats? What do I need to figure out? What am I not doing good enough at? What do I need to get better at? That level of stress is good. And a lot of people who don't do that well in life, it's because they were too calm. They were too relaxed. And they were just like their calm relaxation turned into obliviousness and giant threats and opportunities just like, just whizzed right past them. And so part of me, when I hear stories like that, when Kathleen always tells me about this biology test that I still have nightmares about, part of me is like, man, what was I thinking? And part of me is like, no, I'm actually glad that I was not resting on my laurels during a time in my life where I was truly had one foot in this new academic world and one foot in the fantasy land that I grew up in of like, yeah, you don't need to go to school, just go skiing 6 days a week. That's fun. And so it was stressful, but I'm kind of glad that it happened.
I had this thought while you were talking about the chip on your shoulder and the opportunity to go to USC, and you didn't want to squander it, right? You didn't want to waste it. You wanted to take advantage of that. Do you think there's any part of your brain at that moment when you're at USC that thought, I for some reason made the choice not to ski off the backside a squall with my friends that day. I'm still alive. I better not waste this chance to be successful. Like I
I
kind of dodged a bullet there.
I think those thoughts came to me later when I was
Yeah.
a slightly more mature adult. I think in the immediate years after Brendan Bryan died, I don't think I had the maturity or the intellectual capability to really contextualize what happened and what it meant in my life. So it
Yeah.
wasn't until maybe 10 or 15 years later that I could really think about it. The other thing is their death, I think, it's true that time heals all wounds. Everyone can relate to
Yeah.
that when you've lost someone, but in a weird way, their death was almost the opposite because the older I get, the more I realize that they were children in a way that I didn't
Yeah.
appreciate at the time. And I look back
Yeah.
and now as I get older, I have a greater appreciation for the life that they lost and the life that they didn't get to live that I could not understand or fathom when I was 17 too. And so I don't know if I thought about that in college. I think it was mainly this chip of everyone else went to high school and they know how education works and they can do more than write their name and add single digit numbers and I can't. So I need to work harder. And I was also just so
Right.
terrified of being embarrassed if I was in a study group and I didn't understand something so elementary that everyone else did. That always really freaked me out.
Do I understand correctly that growing up, you had a stutter and public speaking or speaking was harder for you, maybe because you didn't have that high school experience to develop those skills. And now you fly all over the world speaking about your book, speaking about the psychology of money and investing and these different short stories of different people and how to approach money and risk and financial perspectives. Was that a big speed bump to overcome? Is that something you continue to face and work to overcome? What is, you know, I've always been pretty good at speaking. Growing up, I was in 4-H and we used to, at 12, 13 years old, used to have to get up and give updates to our peers. And so I have always felt pretty comfortable with that and never dealt with something like that. So how does that affect you or did that affect you? And how does it continue to affect you?
Yeah, so I absolutely grew up with a fairly severe stutter that I still have, that most people don't know because I've learned how to overcome it, and I'll get to that in just a moment how I do that. But it was true, when I was a child, up until I was a teenager, I had a very difficult time speaking, not just public speaking, but to anybody and basic speaking. Stuttering is more common than people think, but most people don't know about it because most stutterers don't talk that much. And I'm willing to bet that
Right.
if anyone listening, if you have a friend or a coworker who you think is very quiet and just doesn't speak a lot, there's a decent chance that actually that person is a stutterer, and they hide their stutter by not speaking. And when I look back, it's actually pretty sad to remember when I was a child and I was in a friend group or in school and I had something creative to say or funny to say or insightful to say. And I kept my mouth shut because I knew I was not going to be able to get it out fluently. And so it had a pretty big impact on me. And there were several times, particularly in elementary school, when the teachers knew not to call on me. My parents would tell them, "Don't call on Morgan because he can't speak." And so the teachers did, but a couple times we'd have a substitute who wouldn't know. And I remember one time in particular, I think I was in fourth grade, fifth grade maybe, and a substitute asked me to read aloud in front of the class, and it was as disastrous as you can imagine. And it was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my childhood. The entire classroom burst into laughter. What's interesting is that uh, if most people see somebody with Down syndrome, let's say, 99% of people can instantly recognize what disability that person has and instantly
Right.
understand that you should not make fun of this person, that it's not that person's fault. 99% of people will understand that immediately. Stuttering is
Right.
so hidden that even very good, empathetic, nice people, if they hear somebody stutter, will make fun of them and laugh at them. And
Yeah.
and because they're so unfamiliar with it, people are comfortable discriminating against disabilities that they're unfamiliar with, and stuttering really
Right.
falls into that group. So it's almost socially acceptable to make fun of a stutterer, even if they can't do anything about it. Now, how did I overcome it? Because I would say I still stutter around my wife and my parents because they are the only people who I know will not judge me. And but
Hmm.
how did I get over it? It's a combination of two things. One is being able to anticipate which sounds are going to trip you up and be able to forecast that when you're speaking. So when I'm speaking to you right now, or when you speak to me, both of us have in our head, we can kind of see two or three words ahead of what we're about to
Right.
say. And one of the first trick to get over stuttering is to anticipate which sounds are going to trip you up. And then the second skill is to come up with a different word, swap out a different word that's not going to trip you up. And I would say it was probably by the time I was about 14 or 15 that I could anticipate which sounds were going to trip me up. And it honestly wasn't until I was probably 30 that I had the vocabulary that would allow me to very quickly, in real time, swap out a problem word for a word that was going to be easier for me to say. And to this day, one of the things that I cannot do is read from a transcript. Because when I read from a transcript, I can't swap out words on the fly like I need to be able to do to get around the words that are going to trip me up. And so it's still very much with me. There are a lot of famous people who stutter. Tom Brokaw from NBC News was a big stutterer. Who else? There's several famous actors who do this. Like it's a bigger problem than people
Well,
think.
our current president has overcome a stutter, if I
Thank
remember
you.
correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yes.
and and I met him like, it was a big group. I was, on Capitol Hill advocating within a big diabetes group. He was vice president at the time. We had a bunch of kids with type 1 diabetes with us, and he came through, and in that moment, it was really interesting. You talk about forecasting, and so much of now broadcasting, when I'm on camera talking or even off camera just calling the what's happening in a race, I end up having to think 2 or 3 thoughts ahead and almost let my subconscious drive what I'm actually speaking, which sometimes gets me in trouble. But, you end up forecasting a little further ahead, and it's incredibly cool to me to hear you say that. Be like, "Oh, I know these tones, these sounds are what trip me up. So I'm just gonna move them out of the I'm gonna swap something where I don't, so you don't use words that create that stuff." That's I mean,
Yeah, and there's some things that you can't swap out. One of the things that I've is so interesting to me. I used to have a coworker. This is my stuttering in real time. I cannot say his name. His name is spelled Ilan. You can probably figure out what it is. I can't say it for the life of me. I can't do it. And so there's some people who are like, I can't come up with a new word for his name. And so I would always have to just like find a way to skirt around saying his name. And people would be like, oh, who are you having lunch with? And I'd be like, oh, that guy who I sit next to. Like I can't say his name. So there's some things that it still does trip me up. But for the most part, and I've read that this is really the only way that stutterers get over it is by forecasting and swapping out a different word that's going to be easier for you to say.
Wow.
And the other thing is that there's not a set list of words that are going to be hard to say. There's some like that guy's name that the combination, the IL combination at the beginning of his name is just almost impossible for me to say. But it's not even words that trip you up. It's specific sounds. And so you need to be able to anticipate which sounds in the words that you're about to say are going to be problematic for you.
That's really like I'm sitting here going, okay, what word starts with IL? Like the Iliad, right? Would be I could, not
Yeah, that would be tough for me to say.
and I don't know that would come up in everyday conversations as such. I mean, it probably would for you because of all of the research you do for your books and things like that.
One other really, I'll add one little bit to this.
Yeah.
Most stutterers have a very hard time saying their own name, which is a very unfortunate thing that comes with stuttering. Now, and that's true for me too.
Right.
So when people meet you, if I said, "What's your name?" you would say Charlie. If someone to me says, "What's your name?" I can't just say my name. So I have to add in another word before it. So whenever someone asks my name, I say, "It's Morgan." I have to throw in a little word before it to kind of get the momentum up to be able to
Get
say
that
it.
sound tonation.
And so
going.
there's all these little quirks to get it going. It's very difficult for me to just say my name on its own as a standalone word. I have to say something to get a little running start to be able to say it.
Okay, so on Speed Bumps, I try and ask the same 3 questions, but before we get to that, I want to talk just a little bit about what it took to publish your first book. Because I understand you were, yes, an author within financial publications. We talked about The Motley Fool and The Wall Street Journal, and you and I have had this conversation offline about what it took to publish. Did you ever lose faith that what you had written wasn't good enough to be published as a book? Did you ever, like, in those quiet, dark moments as you're going to sleep at night, being like, I'll never be an author, or I'm not a published author, and this isn't good enough? Were those thoughts ever in the back of your brain?
Well, here's what's interesting. In 2018, I published a blog post called The Psychology of Money. And it was a monster blog post. It's almost 10,000 words, which is like a third of a book. It's a massive, massive post. And I just wanted to put together basically everything that I've learned about behavioral finance over the previous 10 or 15 years. And the post did extraordinary. In the financial blogging world, it performed as good as you can hope for. Over 1 million people read it. It was by an order of magnitude, like the biggest blog post I'd ever written. So at the time it was like, great, there's a book in there. That's it. People love this material. They love the concept. Like, boom, I'm going to turn this into a book. I thought absolute slam dunk, and took it to every publisher in America. And the expectation was like, oh, this is going to be a massive contract. You're going to get a huge advance for this. Every single publisher in America turned it down. Every single one. And even when we went to them and said like, hey, you don't even need to give me any advance, like I'll take it for free. You don't have to give me any money up front. Like, please just help me publish this book. No, not interested in it. And the ones who were polite enough to provide feedback were like, nobody's going to read this book. This book has no chance of ever happening. And at the time, I think I could toggle my personality in between, they don't know what they're talking about. These guys are idiots. This is going to be a great book. And then the next day I could be like, of course they know what they're talking about. These are the presidents of the largest publishing houses in America. Of course they know. So anyways, a couple months later, a very small publisher out of England called Harriman House, which is basically like 5 people in a WeWork in just outside of London. I got in contact with them and they're like, hey, we love this idea. I think it's a great idea. We're happy to publish Psychology of Money. We're not going to give you any money up front, but you can earn back in royalties if it sells. And I was like, great. Out of desperation, I didn't have any other choice. It was like, great. Like, that's all I got on my plate. Like, that's the only offer. Let's do it. And so I think because of the background of that, of every publisher in America saying nobody's ever going to read this book. Yeah, it was tough to write it. I still felt pretty confident about it. But anyways, Harriman published it in 2020, and 4 years in, it's now one of the best-selling finance books of all time. And that, I think, because of where it began, makes it feel that much better. Like when you start with a really low cost basis, when people are literally telling you this is never going to work, and then it works, it feels so much better than if they told you from day one how good you are. And so it was very difficult at the time, but looking back, I'm glad it happened. It gives me so much more perspective for what it became.
Well, I loved it. I loved reading The Psychology of Money, and same as ever, like the way you take complex financial models and ideologies and bring it back to like digestible chunks with a story and anecdotes. It's like you walk away with perspectives that, you know, I know you were a valet at the Balboa Beach Club. Did I get that right?
That's right.
And you, so you got to drive a bunch of really nice cars. And this will lead into one of my three questions here shortly. But your perspective on what people think of you if you're driving a supercar, right? Versus what you think of you if you're driving a supercar is incredible. Like the perspective shift, it's almost head over heels what it should be. But then you look at it and you pull back and you go, "Oh yeah, that's what people think of this versus what I think people think of
Yeah.
me." So read the book so you get that story because it's very interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So in my life, I've gotten to meet some incredible people, yourself, other athletes, celebrities, things like that. What is the coolest or most meaningful personal interaction you've had with somebody and why?
I'll tell you, this probably won't mean much to other people, but it was so meaningful to me. My writing hero growing up was a guy named Jason Zweig. He writes for the Wall Street Journal, and in my mind, he's the greatest financial writer and one of the greatest journalist writers, I think, of our era. He was just a hero of mine. He was who I wanted to be when I grew up, for when all my early years in writing, and I serendipitously ran into him at a conference about a decade ago, and I was just completely starstruck. Oh my gosh, it's Jason Zweig! I get to talk to him, and he handed me his card, and he said, "Hey, reach out sometime." And I think I was probably shaking, and I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, I'd love to have lunch with you sometime." And he said, "Great, but please do not come to New York just to see me." He was like, "Wait until you've got something else going on. Don't just come up to see me." And I lied. I bold-faced lied over email, and I said, "Oh, I'm coming to New York tomorrow anyways. I'm going up for something already," which was totally a lie. So I flew to New York to see him, and he could not have been kinder or nicer or more helpful to who was just a terrified 25-year-old at the time trying to find his way in writing. I think that interaction meant nothing to him and meant the world to me. And I think when you are in his shoes, as you, Charlie, have been, as many other people have been, you actually don't know when those moments are taking place, when you are changing somebody's life and you don't even know it. And so that's something I look back on as my career, as just one of the most meaningful career days of my life. And to him, it was just a quick, casual hamburger with a stranger.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the moments that sticks out.
How cool. What an incredible lunch. And incredible perspective for him to be like, yeah, just whenever you're coming up, like we'll get together. And you're like, no, I'm definitely coming up for something else. And sure, I'll be there. Okay. Now, number two, you get to drive a bunch of really cool cars as a valet. What is your dream car? Do you have it in your garage? Do you ever want it one day, or is it always going to be a pipe dream?
I think I love cars. I admire cars. I have a list of cars that I love that I don't drive and I don't buy, even though I could. And I'll tell you why. You teed up this thing that I call the man in the car paradox, which is this thing that I learned as a valet, which was, I'll briefly explain it. When I was a valet and somebody would pull into the hotel driving a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, whatever it might be, never once did I look at the driver and say, "Whoa, that guy's so cool. Like, look how awesome that guy is." What I did is I imagined myself as the driver, and I would say, if I was the driver, people would be looking at me and saying, "Wow, look how cool Morgan is." And I was like, do we see the irony? Like, I never care about the driver, but I want to be the driver because I think people will then care about me. Once I got that in my head of
But
like,
what you have just done is looked at the driver and not thought that guy is cool, but I want to be that guy so people think I'm cool, even though you've just thought that guy's not cool.
right,
It's
right.
so
And so
interesting.
like once I got that in my head, it was like, I don't know if I want a fancy car, because the social status that you think you're getting from it, you're not. Even when people are paying attention to the car, they're imagining themselves as you. They're not paying any attention to you. And so once I got that, it was like, look, I love fancy cars. I love McLarens. I love Lamborghinis. I love luxury cars. I love Bentleys. I love all of them. But my desire to have one is severely diminished because of what I have seen, like the lack of social status people think they're going to get from them. But I think the coolest car I drove, I don't know if you've ever driven anything like this. I think it was called a Stryker.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is it Stryker? Am I getting that right? I remember driving one of those, and the gearbox, you could see all the levers in it. It was like a clear gearbox. So when you shifted, you saw all the parts moving beneath the car. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. That was the coolest design in any car that I had ever driven.
All right. Now we're going to circle back and ask you for what's the best advice you've ever gotten and from whom? Something that, you look back on and are like, okay, I got to remember this. This is something that when I'm really struggling, I'm going to go to my memory bank and draw from to keep me moving forward.
I think the best advice that I've tried to follow as a writer, and I don't know if I got this from any specific person, but picked it up from many other writers, was write for an audience of one, which is me. Which is, I call it selfish writing, which is when I'm writing, I do not sit back and ask, what does the audience want to read? What do they want to hear? What will they be interested in? That very quickly turns to pandering or acting. I want to write for an audience of one, which is me. So I want to write stories that I think are interesting in a tone that I think is fun to read, using examples that are appealing to me. And then I take a leap of faith that if I like it, maybe you will as well. But it's always just a very selfish endeavor. And I think when you are writing for yourself, it's fun. And it shows in the writing. And when you are pandering to other people, that shows too. So it's almost the opposite of the advice you probably got from your high school English teacher, which is like, know your audience and write for them. No. Write for yourself. If you think it's great, other people probably will as well. And when you're not acting, when you're doing just truly writing out of your heart because you think it's great, that's when you're going to do your best work.
Awesome. Well, Morgan, thank you so much for joining us on Speed Bumps. This has been a lot of fun. Some real serious conversation about speed bumps along the way. Some great reminiscing with hilarious stories. I'm glad that all the seats were taken in the business section at USC and you sat next to Kathleen in the econ section. We feel so lucky to have you in our lives and be able to do things like this and also be able to enjoy your books because they are great. I will make sure to link them in the show notes so people can find them and either order the audiobooks or the paper hardback copies as well. So thank you very much for joining us on Speed Bumps, Morgan, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Charlie.